first and foremost, thank you so much for coming on the platform. It's definitely an honor to have you on today.
Happy to be here.
Okay, we're gonna get right into it. For the viewers who may not recognize you, please let them know definitely who you are and where you're from.
My name is Tanya Hernandez. I'm from New York City and I teach at Fordham University School of Law.
Wow, okay, all the way from NY. I want to talk about the book. Can you tell us about the name of the book and where we can get it and what it's about?
The title of the book is Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. It is now available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, IndieBound, and the press's website as well, Beacon Press.
All right. Now, can you
Oh,
tell us a little?
I'm sorry, you asked me what the book was about.
Yeah. Tell them a little, give them a little background on it. But I'm sure they're gonna want to check it out. I want to check it out as well.
I got so involved in selling mode, I forgot to mention what it was about. So the book is essentially about trying to give details about the ways in which Latinos harbor anti-Black bias in ways that can often be either dismissed as it's just sort of like a misunderstanding. It's not as serious as white Anglo anti-Blackness. It's not really anti-Blackness because they're mixed themselves and some of them are Black. And so all of these myths about anti-Blackness within Latino communities, I try to disrupt and to be a little bit more transparent about. And I do that by looking at the spaces in which Latinos are very down to earth about being honest regarding the anti-Blackness in our communities. That is within anti-discrimination law. So when Latinos are experiencing discrimination themselves, Afro-Latinos being discriminated against by white appearing or white presenting or white identifying Latinos, they do so within cases regarding a denial of access to housing, denial of access to public accommodation, trying to purchase a home, try to get a salary increase or apply for a job, meaning all the arenas in which anti-discrimination law operates is the space in which Latinos are much more above board about articulating how Latino anti-Blackness operates vis-a-vis not only against Afro-Latinos, but also against African Americans, Africans, and other people of the African diaspora, right? So it's a global anti-Blackness that I'm trying to sort of pick up in the book.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Like you say, global anti-Blackness. Let them know one more time where they can pre-order this book at.
It can be pre-ordered on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, IndieBound.org, and the press itself, Beacon Press.
Okay, cool. Now I wanted to ask you about a couple terms that's commonly used. Like I know on the West Coast, people say brown a lot or brown pride. And maybe like in the Midwest or the South, they may say Latino or Spanish. Like I'm in Cleveland, a lot of people may say Hispanic or Spanish, and some people may be offended. They may not be. So my question is, what is a Latino?
Okay. There are a number of terms, as you rightfully point out, and it is true that there's geographic variation on how people want to be identified and what names they gravitate towards. But in the most sort of general way of defining, Latino is someone who is a U.S. residing individual, but of Latin American, Caribbean ancestry. So either they just immigrated from, or their people at some point, decades or centuries before, immigrated from a Latin American, Caribbean space. And so that sort of continual part of the community and cultural maintenance of Latino music, dance, foods, etc., and Spanish language, all obviously to varying degrees, is part of what makes someone Latino, as opposed to someone who is from Spain who comes to as a traveler to the United States. That is not a Latino. Right? Latinos are made in the US, right? It's about being a US residing individual of this ancestry that then gives them this ethnic identity. Now, one thing I do, if you will permit me to, I would like to pick apart a little bit with regards to the language. This idea of calling Latinos brown has sort of come under fire within the last few years, if not more, particularly from Afro-Latinos, that is, Black identifying Latinos. I mean, the slave ships that came to the Americas were not primarily targeting North America, United States. Only 3.5% of the 10.7 million Africans who were forcibly transported to the Americas were brought to what we now call the United States. The vast majority, used to be 65% was the estimate, now we're close to 90%, were brought to Latin America and the Caribbean. And so the legacy of slavery and anti-Blackness, that is a Latin American Spanish-speaking story, if you will, even more than it is a U.S. one, right? Although obviously an important one in the United States. So, why do I bring that about? Or why do I bring that up? Because to call all Latinos brown is a way that, while it may be a point of pride for some, especially West Coast Chicanos, etc., it is somewhat problematic when it erases, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, erases the racial diversity within our ethnic group. Right? To call everybody brown means that the white appearing people who have white privilege, right, however limited, but nonetheless it exists. Right? You show up with the Hernandez last name and you look white, you get a different treatment than the Hernandez who shows up and looks darker, right? Or unambiguously Black, right? And so the idea of calling all Latinos brown, that is no longer such a simple unifying terminology. And then, across different geographic spaces and also across age, generational level, there's also different, preferences about, what individuals like to call themselves. Just like within African American communities, you have generational transitions, between a Negro, African American, Black, etc. Right? So you have that with Latino ethnic identity as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for breaking that down, because you're right. Like you say, we went from what was it, Negro to colored to Afro American, African American, and Black American. But all of the Black Americans don't agree on all of those terms.
Exactly, right. So I think, I mean, my own personal perspective, I want to superimpose it on anybody else, but like my own personal perspective is I don't really get too hung up on the name, the label that people want to put to themselves as far as how they identify. I'm much more concerned about actions and whether or not people are exercising real alliance and solidarity. As opposed to using the right label, whatever the right label is in the given space and time, but exercising anti-Blackness. To me, I care more about the actions than I care about like what little labels you want to give yourself. And obviously, and the labels also change for each individual across time and space. Right?
Let me see. My next question, I wanted to ask you about colorism in Latino culture, because you hear that talked about a little bit more than racism. For the viewers who may not understand that, is there colorism in Latino culture?
There's definitely colorism, and there's also racism. And I can say a little bit about what each of these things are, and then why it is that you may hear more about colorism than you hear about the actual language of racism. Right? So colorism is all about having racial meaning attributed to a color spectrum, right? So the lighter you are, the more you are viewed as intellectually superior, more culturally refined, and the darker you are, the worse that is, right? And that spectrum and those racial meanings are part of our Latin American and Caribbean backgrounds, right? We don't learn that in the US. We come in here already with it, and we learn it across generations from our families, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, etc. So it's not just the recent immigrant issue, and it's not just, it's just the old people. No. It's across generations within our communities. But the reason why I say it's important to not sort of just lump what happens within Latino communities as primarily only about colorism is because, and so I kind of dig into this in the book, the manifestation, right, the acting on of racial exclusion and racism is not only about skin color, right? We tend to think of colorism as only about skin color. There are many instances, right, where someone may not be phenotypically particularly dark, right? So it's not about their color, but their hair texture, their phenotype looks more African than it does European, and that is a problem in Latino communities. Right? And that's not about the color. That's about race, right? That's about a racial understanding of what your ancestry means. Now people say, oh, the one drop rule, that's just a US thing. We may not use language, right, of one drop rule, but we have actions of one drop rule within Latino communities. That is to say, little white looking girl shows up to school, but her father is a dark skinned Afro-Latino. That gets noticed, right? It's not innocuous within Latino communities. And that could be a problem for that little white appearing girl. So that's a way in which there's a silencing about what, the existence of one drop rule, Latino style, but it exists nonetheless.
Okay. Thank you for breaking that down. Now, I got a chance to study abroad in DR in Brazil. So when I was in DR, the school I went to, it was like one of the top schools. So like the professors and the staff and a lot of the students, like you say, they were either like light skinned or more European looking. So like when I would go to the school, I would notice the people that clean the bathrooms, the people that work in the cafeteria, the security guards, they were more brown, they were more dark, but they'll be like, well, we all Dominican, so it can't be racism, So I was like, nah, I don't know. It didn't look fair to me. Like the lighter you were, the higher your pay grade was, or like you say, higher education. Let me see.
And there's a word for that too, what you were directly experiencing and observing, right? And that word is called a pigmentocracy, meaning it's across pigment and understandings of pigment, right? So you don't even have to see the dark color, but if you know somebody is from a particular region in the DR or within a particular region of Brazil, those are the blackity blacks sections. So even if you look white, knowing that you're from the blackity black section also taints you, right? In ways that, right, this is not about just about racial appearance, right? It's also about a racism, a racial understanding, right? Rooted in anti-Blackness.
Okay, let me see. I got a chance to check out one of your videos, and you were talking a little bit about some Latinos, when they come to America, they join white supremacist groups. That's something that's been going on in recent.
Yes, unfortunately. Right. So, the head of the Proud Boys and several of their members are Latinos. The violence in Charlottesville in 2017, Latinos were part of that white supremacist violence in Charlottesville as well. It is unfortunately not aberrational, right? To have Latinos as part of these groups. And people ask me oftentimes, like, but how is this possible? Latinos are discriminated against in the United States. Why would they, even want to join a white supremacist group? Well, we got echoes of this very early on when we looked at what would happen inside prisons. Right? Prisons are some of the most segregated spaces, right, that exist within the United States. And there are Black sections, white sections, Latino sections. But when the violence happens across race lines, Latinos throw in with the white supremacists. It's documented time and time again. And they are policed by other Latino inmates not to associate with Black inmates. So that understanding of, well, we may not be the racial elite, but we don't want to associate and we want to distance ourselves from what we already know from our cultures is problematic as far as Blackness is concerned, let alone African American Blackness, which now gets sort of piled on top of, right? There's the Latin American racism, and then you got the U.S. racism all tying themselves together. So, the lure, to be part of a white supremacist organization is about another way of saying, you may not see me as white, but this is my way to act out my whiteness, right? But I may not appear it, or you may not, think of me in that way, but my actions now, I get to view myself, I get to think of myself as whitening myself by being part of anti-Blackness in an organizational way.
Okay. Now I got a question for you. African Americans and Latino Americans, they share a similar history, colonization, slavery. Moving forward, how can we work together, or like you say, make legal changes, or what advice would you give to somebody that may live in a community where there is some sort of separation or division between the groups?
Well, I mean, I think one of the first things that we really have to get concrete about is a greater racial literacy. And what I mean by that is this: oftentimes, Latinos themselves, right, don't know about our history of slavery. Right? They don't know about the way in which statistically how predominant it was. We've got all kinds of mythologies about like how to explain, the variation in skin tone. Right? Once upon a time, there was a Native American. I mean, it's all kinds of stories that we tell ourselves to explain away the Blackness. And so people are literally ignorant. Right? Similarly, within African American communities and others, we are ignorant, right, about the ways in which anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. Right? So rather than sort of treating it as just about a U.S. dynamic, I think we'd all be better able to engage in true solidarity and projects of coalition if we sort of learn a little bit more about just how entrenched anti-Blackness is, and then thus be better able to recognize it, and similarly get better understanding about the existence of Afro Latinos. Sometimes I've seen this in the newspapers and what have you. Some celebrity or other, will say, that they're Afro Latino, and that gets perceived as, why this person now trying to say that they're Black, right? They've always been Black, right? But they were Latino yesterday. Well, they were always Black and Latino. Like the two things can coexist, right? But Blackness speaks many languages, not just English, because the slave ships went to many places, unfortunately, right? And so not only English-speaking locations. I think that would be a foundational piece, right? Before we could really see, collaborative and sort of community-based organizing that could hold for longer than, a protest or two.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, definitely. Let me see. I could recall an experience when I was studying abroad in DR. I met Ozzie Virgil. For the viewers who may not know him, he was the first Dominican to play in Major League Baseball. Dominicans love baseball. They probably the best baseball players in the world. But we had a conversation with him, and he was saying that he really, growing up in the DR, he didn't look at himself as a Black person. But when he got to America, and I think he played for Detroit, and then when they would go down south and stuff, the whites would say, well, you got to get dressed with the Black people, or you got to sit at the back of the bus with the Black people. And then he say, he learned about his Blackness and stuff like that. And even on the flip side with African Americans, like, for example, one time we was watching a boxing match, and it was basically like a Black guy and a white guy was fighting, but the people watching the fight, they was carrying on. And then when the fight was over, the announcer went up to him and he started speaking Spanish. And then the guy next to me, he like, I thought he was Black. And I'm like, he is Black. He just speaks Spanish. But to a lot of African Americans, they look at you as something else because they are ignorant as well to that history and that culture. And there's so many similarities. We got so much in common musically and food and the way we dance and everything else.
one bone of contention I would just put out there. There's this idea of, oh, I didn't learn about blackness or discrimination until, right, I came to the United States. And what that sort of like hides are the ways in which there's some serious discrimination that happens within Latin America. That was like my first book, right? But it gets recast as something else, right? Meaning the racial oppression within Latin America, right, and Spanish-speaking Caribbean nations has been so intense that Black people themselves have not always had the space within which to sort of articulate and understand their experiences as race-based experiences. But it doesn't mean that it's not happening, right? And instead, if you live in a place where, like in Latin America, for the longest time, if you brought up issues of racism, people would turn around and say, "You're the racist." Right? If you live in that kind of environment, right, then you have to, in some respects, reinterpret what's happening to you in order to survive it. Right? So a survival skill has long been, well, they didn't want to let me in the door, but maybe that's because I wasn't, addressed properly. They didn't want to sell me that house, but maybe it's because they thought I didn't have enough money for it. Right? We always are like having these built-in excuses because when we try to articulate the issue as a race issue, they beat us down. And so it's not so much always that it's about a discovery of the discrimination or discovery of oneself as Black. It's about now, I know some people may think this is ironic, but in the United States, there's sometimes more of a space to breathe and actually allow yourself to talk the language of Blackness and racism. Whereas you are silenced and it's taboo within so much of Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, that's starting to change. There are many Afro-Latin groups on the ground who are doing very important social justice movement activism. But I'm trying to give you sort of like a historical, short snippet, a picture of what have the challenges been.
Oh yeah, definitely. I truly appreciate you. But I could relate because like you say, like when I was in Latin America studying, it wasn't commonly talked about. Because when I kept talking about it, people were like, I don't know. And then I'm like, okay, maybe I'm tripping. I'm gonna be quiet. And I waited like maybe a couple days, and then they wanted to talk about it more. The students was looking at me like, "What do you think?" And I'm like, "Nah, I don't want to say nothing." But you could tell that they, for a long time, some things that had been on their mind and they wanted to address them. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, Taye, he thinks it's a race problem in the DR." I'm like, "It's a race problem everywhere that's been colonized. And you got Black people that's been enslaved for hundreds of years." And then when slavery ended, they don't have no clothes, no shelter, no food, no education, no tools, no equipment. So a lot of Black Americans think that only happened in America, when the reality is in Latin America, it happened 90% of the slave trade is where it happened at. So that's very important. Let's see. Now you mentioned you got another book. You got some other books out.
Well, yes, I like to call this the new book that's coming out is like part 3 of the trilogy. Right? I call good science fiction that's based in like reality. It's a trilogy. Right. So the first book was called Racial Subordination in Latin America. Right. So that was a lot of the detail that I just shared with you about sort of how anti-Blackness shows up within Latin America, and also what has been the journey of these Afro-Latin social justice movements who are trying to change that. Right. So I call it, Racial Subordination in Latin America and the New Civil Rights Response. So that was part 1 of the trilogy. Part 2 then shifted gears and looked just at the United States and how Latin American ways of excusing racism by talking about, oh, we're all mixed race, so we don't know Blackness because we're all mixed. How that kind of language discourse was starting to appear in the United States with regards to multiracial identity, mixed race identity. So the second book sort of uses the Latin America frame to try to understand what's going on with this idea of multiracial identity and what I call the misperception that multiracial experiences of discrimination are somehow different than what regular Black people experience. Let's put it that way. And I wanted this book to sort of unmask that. That while people's identities may be very fluid, you may have all kinds of things that are part of what your identity, what makes up your personal identity, that when you experience discrimination, it is unfortunately a very crude experience. That's why it's not something we like, right? It's discrimination. And when that happens, it doesn't happen because you're mixed. It happens because of some part of the mixture that is viewed as detestable. More often than not, Blackness, right? So I sort of use the background of having analyzed Latin America and mixed race language and excuse making to unpack what's happening with multiracial identity in part 2. And now part 3 of the trilogy brings those two things together to look at Latinos in the United States and how they try to get away with their discrimination in housing, in education, in employment, etc., right? By saying, oh, that's, I excluded that Black person, but that wasn't about racism because I can't be biased because I am Latino. That looks like a pseudo defense to discrimination. I'm Latino, so, I'm mixed, so I can't possibly, have caused this discrimination. So this new book, it's called Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. This is the part 3 of the trilogy that tries to sort of like educate the population, Latinos and the rest of the United States alike, about this growing problem. Latinos are growing in number, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be a more racially enlightened space if we do not intervene directly and call out the anti-Blackness that exists, and try to make it part of the solution, right, to pursuing equality. Right? If we only look at white Anglo people, we are then missing out on all the other folks in our nation that support and sustain white supremacy. Right? It doesn't stand up all alone just because white Anglos are holding it up. It's because there's a bunch of other silent, non-whites who were there. Oh, okay, are holding it up as well. And so in order to really directly attack that, you have to name it, right, in order to be able to do something about it.
Okay. Wow, this was a phenomenal episode, very enlightening. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing and continue to do. Definitely let the viewers know one more time where they could get the book. So I want to make sure that they get it and check you out and support you.
The book is available right now for pre-order. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes and Nobles. You can get it at indiebound.org or independent bookstores. I'll actually be at a couple of bookstores. If you want to know about sort of either meet me in person or meet me virtually, I can tell you a little bit about that as well. So I'll just go ahead. Okay. Wonderful. So the places I'm going to be starting in August, if you're in the DC area, I'm just looking at my little schedule right here. In DC, I will be at Politics and Prose on August 27th at 5 p.m. If you are in New York, Brooklyn, I will be in a book called Café con Libros, an Afro-Latinx feminist bookstore is how the Café con Libros describe themselves. That's going to be on September 7th. And that will be, I think, will be a virtual event. But I'll be in person in New York City on September 15th, the start of Hispanic Heritage Month, though this will be a very interesting kind of start to Hispanic Heritage Month. Let's talk about anti-Blackness within Latino communities at Fordham Race Law Center. It's an open event, September 15th at 6 p.m.
All right. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. It's been another episode of Taye Speaks. So until next time, family, peace.
Thank you.
You're welcome.